Hey guys, tonight we begin with the deliciously questionable world of ancient Roman street food. From greasy Thermopylae counters to honey-soaked fig cakes eaten in the shadows of marble columns, Roman junk food wasn't just fuel. It was flavor, status, and survival, all rolled into one mystery sausage. Picture yourself not as a triumphant general or silver-tongued orator, but as a weary Roman citizen trudging down a sunburnt cobblestone street, the kind where every step sticks slightly in the heat, and the air clings to your skin like damp wool. Your sandals have long lost their pride, the leather cracked, the soles whispering complaints with each step. A headache brews in your skull, the inevitable price of last night's wine. Thin, cheap, and plentiful, and maybe a few misjudged hours spent sweating in the steamy haze of the public baths. Your stomach growls, not with the hunger of luxury, but the craving for something immediate. Not noble fare carved from roasted boar, or discussed at length over debates about olive presses. No, you want grease, salt, heat, something that can be chewed and forgotten in the same breath. You follow the scent, not pleasant exactly, but undeniably compelling: hot oil, fish, old garlic, and cooked meat of unknown origin. The source is a thermopylaeum, Rome's answer to the street food stall. At first glance, it looks more like a broken piece of temple than a place to buy food. Stone counters worn smooth by generations of elbows, sunken earthen pots bubbling with thick, ambiguous stews. No menus, no promises, and certainly no guarantees. Just holes in marble slabs filled with whatever had survived the day, thick dollops of oily meat mixtures, starchy gruels flavored more by hope than ingredients, and perhaps the occasional surprise in texture that made you pause just long enough to regret. One of those pots might hold cheese balls, fried until they audibly squeak against your teeth, tiny defiant cries of dairy turned dangerous. Another might present you with sausages, their casing greasy and taut, stuffed with meat that could have come from pig or goat or ambition alone. And then there was the ever-present garum, the fermented fish sauce that defied description. More than seasoning, garum was a declaration, a challenge even, that flavor mattered more than dignity. A single drop could transform bland gruel into something memorable, though not always in a good way. Its smell haunted entire neighborhoods, drifting into corners of the city like a reminder that food in Rome came with consequences. Cleanliness, naturally, was flexible. The vendor might greet you with a nod, the same tunic he'd slept in clinging to his frame, and a ladle that could recount the fall of 2 consuls. But hygiene wasn't the point. The food was hot, mostly, and if it didn't ask too many questions, neither would you. Because these stalls weren't just for eating, they were Roman equalizers. Everyone, from builders to students to aimless poets and tourists from the provinces, needed to eat. And here, in front of the boiling dolia, everyone stood with coins in hand and hunger in their eyes. Sometimes what you got tasted like last week. Sometimes it burned with spice and salt and made you forget your debts. But always it was enough, just barely enough, to get you through the next forum speech, the next scuffle in the street, the next long hour avoiding your landlord. You'd walk away, the lentil stain on your toga proof of your transaction, stomach lined with bravery or perhaps folly. That was Roman fast food, not meant to impress, only to sustain. A bowl of survival, a mouthful of chaos, and maybe, just maybe, a bite of glory. The marketplace never slept, not truly. Even after you've shuffled away from the thermopylaeum, fingers slick with residual oil and your dignity somewhat dented, the cravings linger. Not a feast, not something ceremonial, just a mouthful of something crunchy to carry you through the monotony of civic life. The forum buzzes with idle noise, filled with complaints about taxes, proposals about grain, and the ceaseless drone of orators who believe wheat subsidies are riveting. You pretend to listen, nodding occasionally, but your ears are on strike and your stomach remains unconvinced. That's when the familiar call rings out over the crowd, the unmistakable bark of chickpea vendors. They sell them hot, roasted over open coals, handed out in humble clay bowls or wrapped tightly in scraps of old cloth. The Romans called them saeser aretinum, which sounded elegant enough to disguise the fact that you were eating salted gravel masquerading as legumes. The chickpeas, though humble, were an empire-wide phenomenon. Soldiers stuffed them into satchels before a march. Politicians nibbled them absent-mindedly while accepting bribes. Children, still too young for wine or war, sucked on them like apprentices preparing for adulthood's harder truths. They cracked under your teeth, firm enough to test the boundaries of Roman dentistry, which, truth be told, hadn't quite figured out how to handle snacks that doubled as blunt instruments. The flavor was simple. Salt. That all-purpose Roman remedy. Salt didn't just enhance, it masked. It turned spoil into spice, disappointment into sustenance. And when it came to chickpeas, salt made them passable. Occasionally, you'd bite into one that was slightly soft, giving the illusion of being cooked properly. For a moment, you'd believe in possibility. Then the next would shatter like a curse and remind you that Roman cuisine wasn't here to coddle. There were no sauces, no dips, no whimsical flavor profiles, no garlic aioli, no chili lime dust, just roasted or burnt, crunchy or rock hard. This was food built for endurance, not indulgence. But the Romans swore by them. They'd claimed chickpeas aided digestion, promoted virility, encouraged bold thought, all traits suspiciously convenient to the man trying to sell you a pouchful. And yet, they worked. Not because they were magical, but because they kept you moving. They didn't rot easily. They traveled well. You could throw them at your cousin during a gladiator match, or carry a few in your toga folds like a portable meal plan. They were Rome's equivalent of an energy bar, cheap, utilitarian, and somehow universally accepted. And most importantly, they gave your hands something to do while your ears endured yet another senator railing about bridge maintenance. That was the genius of Roman snacking. It wasn't just about feeding the body. It was about feeding the moment, giving you just enough comfort to get through whatever madness came next. And in a world that never paused, where even hunger had to be efficient, a handful of roasted chickpeas might just be the closest thing to peace Rome ever allowed. Sometimes, amid the din and grime of Roman daily life, your body begins to crave something gentler, less abrasive, less cynical. You've survived the lentil stew, roulette, and chickpeas that doubled as pebbles, and now your eyes are drawn to something unexpected. Golden orbs glistening in the sun, piled high on a tray, balanced atop a vendor's calloused hands. The vendor catches your glance, grins knowingly, and utters a single word with the confidence of someone selling seduction disguised as dessert, globuli. They look harmless enough at first, small, round, slightly uneven, but Roman sweets always come with an edge. These were no innocent pastries. Each one was a tiny act of culinary rebellion against the empire's otherwise brutal diet. Deep-fried spheres of cheese mixed with flour, blistered in hot oil until their crusts turned crisp and crackled with promise. Then, as if to ensure maximum decadence, they were doused in honey. Not drizzled, drenched, sticky, glossy, unapologetic. When you bite into one, you understand the danger. The outer crunch gives way to a scalding, molten center. Cheese lava with a hint of dairy vengeance. Misjudge the angle or the force, and you might launch a glob of ricotta into the street or down the front of your toga. And the honey, it doesn't stay on the cake. It finds your fingers, your wrists, the fabric near your elbows. A magnet for bees, dogs, and bad decisions. But oh, they were adored. The recipe appears in Apicius, the Romans' closest approximation of a cookbook, a compilation of dishes designed to impress, seduce, and occasionally assault the palate. Globuli were special. They weren't your daily snack. They were event food, brought out at festivals, dinners, or when a host wanted to display generosity with just a touch of madness. They straddled the line between dessert and weapon, between indulgence and hazard. The texture was an alchemy of contradictions. The shells snapped under your teeth, but the inside clung with a warmth that flirted with disaster. The taste? A strange but addictive harmony of savory cheese and cloying honey, like cheesecake had joined a gladiatorial match. There was no balance, only excess, and that, perhaps, was the point. Roman sweets weren't meant to be polite. Frying cheese in oil wasn't for the frugal. It took ingredients, labor, and confidence, which is why globuli were rarely seen on the street stalls where sausage reigned. They belonged to the wealthier class, the ones who could afford to eat with reckless abandon and servants on hand to deal with the aftermath. But every now and then, one of these treats escaped the domus and found its way into the open air. A rogue dessert for the common man. And so you stand there, licking honey from your fingers, wondering if this is what the gods eat when they're feeling mischievous. The answer is probably yes, because nothing in Rome that tasted this good ever came without consequences. Sometimes refinement calls to you, not through elegance or status, but through sheer fatigue. Your jaw aches from chickpeas. Your fingers are still glossy from honeyed cheese balls, and now your palate longs for a sweetness that won't explode or chip a tooth. That's when your eyes catch something promising. A vendor stands beneath the shadow of a crumbling portico, holding a tray of plump, glossy fruits, not fresh, but transformed. Dates. Stuffed, sweetened, and dangerous in their own quiet way. They're deceptively simple. You split one open, and inside is packed a sliver of almond or walnut, carefully chopped, deliberately placed. The whole thing is then rolled in honey, or maybe completely drowned in it, depending on how wealthy or indulgent the vendor is feeling today. Some recipes kept it minimal. Others layered spice or cinnamon, crushed nuts, or even bits of flower petals, just to hint at sophistication. But don't be fooled by their innocent appearance. These dates weren't light snacks. They were weighty, dense, and unyielding. Like edible pebbles of sweetness compressed by ambition. Left in the sun too long, they could harden into something approaching a projectile. But in their prime, they were a chewy, sticky marvel, coating your tongue and teeth with a sugary residue that lingered like a half-forgotten memory. These were the desserts of both lords and laborers. At grand banquets, they were paraded around as signs of good taste and wealth. At street festivals, they were handed to children with sticky fingers and wide eyes. Soldiers brought them to the front lines, perhaps less for nutrition than for a reminder of home. Lovers passed them like edible trinkets, messy, indulgent, and memorable. Nutritionally, they were quite effective. The dates gave you sugar and stamina. The nuts added protein. The honey made everything feel more like a treat and less like rationed survival. And they were surprisingly portable, wrapped in fig leaves, slipped into pouches, even used as gifts or offerings. In a city that thrived on conquest and chaos, these little bundles were proof that something sweet could still be made from the dust. They were a snack, yes, but also a symbol. That even in a world of pigeon-infested forms and overcrowded bathhouses, there was room for a moment of pleasure that didn't come at the cost of your digestive system, unless you ate too many, which, given their taste, you probably would. The Roman appetite was an ever-curious beast, and once the sweetness of dates or the crunch of chickpeas wore off, it tended to wander toward indulgence with a twist of absurdity. Enter the dormouse. Not a metaphor, not a joke. An actual, twitching, wide-eyed rodent made plump and decadent in the name of luxury. In a world where flamingo tongues graced elite banquet tables and fish sauce doubled as both condiment and challenge, the dormouse stood as a bizarre pinnacle of culinary theater. These weren't the scavengers darting across alleyways. These were specially bred delicacies, pampered from birth. Roman aristocrats kept them in little ceramic jars called gleraria, essentially mouse-sized luxury apartments with food slots and no exits. The idea was simple and brutal. Feed them well, restrict their movement, and let nature fatten them for the table. Then came the stuffing: herbs, minced pork, crushed nuts. Once packed like edible purses of opulence, they were roasted or drizzled with honey, sometimes both. Because why stop at strange when you could aim for scandalous? And yes, they were eaten whole, tails and all. Guests at lavish dinners would lift them daintily, as though that gesture alone could disguise the fact that they were consuming something that squeaked in the wild just a few days prior. The taste, according to ancient accounts, was supposedly nutty, but one suspects that was more a defense mechanism than an honest review. These weren't snacks of the poor or even the moderately wealthy. This was showmanship. You served dormice to prove you could, that you had coin to spare and a willingness to flirt with absurdity. You weren't just rich, you were eccentric, daring, avant-garde. You were the kind of person who could make a mouse fashionable. It wasn't even illegal. Dormouse farming was regulated, taxed, and documented. Their images appeared in mosaics. Their presence at feasts was a culinary status symbol. Rome, after all, wasn't interested in restraint. If there was a line, the upper classes crossed it gleefully, often with a dormouse in hand. And yet, as strange as it sounds to us, the dormouse embodied a uniquely Roman concept: power through indulgence. The ability to turn even the humblest creature into a performance, a luxury, a symbol. You weren't just eating a rodent. You were consuming spectacle. You were asserting dominance not just over your dinner guests, but over taste itself. In a city where bread and circus kept the masses fed and distracted, the dormouse was a quiet reminder that excess, when paired with confidence, could become culture. And in the right hands, even the smallest animal could command the biggest reactions. After the garum-drenched meats, the gravel-textured chickpeas, and the eyebrow-raising dormouse courses, you might start longing for something, anything, that didn't challenge your palate or your moral compass. Something sweet, comforting, and more bread than dare. That's when you catch a whiff of something warm and sticky wafting from a nearby stall, a scent that cuts through the fish and vinegar haze of the Roman streets like a promise. You follow it until you find what you didn't know you were craving: honey cakes, or as the Romans called them, libum. Now don't be fooled. These were not the light, springy sponge cakes that inspire poetry and wedding menus today. Roman honey cakes were humble in form, dense in texture, and more likely to bruise your ego than float in your mouth. The dough, a mixture of cheese, flour, and egg, was rolled into thick, compact loaves, then baked directly on bay or fig leaves laid over hot stones or iron pans. The result? A rustic lump that was more nutritional brick than pastry. But then came the Roman flourish: honey. Not painted delicately, not dusted in powdered elegance, drenched, absolutely drowned in golden syrup until the crust shimmered like amber and your fingers stuck together with the persistence of divine punishment. The taste? Imagine something halfway between cheesecake and bread left too close to the fire. It was sweet, but in a complicated way, the cheese giving it a tang, the honey trying to mask it, and the overall result tasting less like dessert and more like a carbohydrate trying to atone for something. But people loved them. They were made for religious ceremonies, household offerings, and family gatherings. Sometimes they were spiritual, sometimes celebratory, sometimes both. You might offer one to your household gods in the morning, and the next day tear into a leftover slice because it was too precious to waste. And like all things Roman, class made a difference. The poor made theirs with barley, minimal cheese, and honey that may have seen better days. The rich added spices, nuts, and exotic imported syrups that doubled the sweetness and tripled the smugness. But regardless of wealth, the cakes were beloved. They were the kind of dessert that traveled across generations, not because they were perfect, but because they were remembered. They stuck with you, literally and metaphorically. Children fought over them, adults hoarded them. Friends fell out over who got the last piece. In a world of constant upheaval, bread soaked in wine and sausages of uncertain origin, the Libum offered something rare: sweetness with structure, indulgence with boundaries. You didn't eat them for joy alone. You ate them because they made you feel like the world, for one bite at least, made a little sense. And sometimes that was enough. By now, you've eaten your way through half of Rome's edible eccentricities, and your taste buds are exhausted. You crave something uncomplicated, maybe even dignified, something you can hold delicately instead of chasing as it oozes down your wrist. That's when you see it, simple, familiar, and almost elegant in its presentation. A fig cake, or what a Roman might call a culinary magic trick using nothing but time, overripe fruit, and sheer determination. Figs were as common in Rome as sandals or gossip. They grew on every corner, filled every market stall, and spoiled faster than you could say import tax. But the Romans, ever practical and ever unwilling to waste, found a way to give figs a second life. They mashed them into dense cakes, sometimes kneading in flour, sometimes nuts, sometimes whatever sweetener hadn't already been slathered on a cheese ball. The result was a squat disc, sticky to the touch, unpredictable in flavor, and surprisingly satisfying, assuming it hadn't fermented into something that bit back. These fig cakes weren't pretty. They didn't sparkle with sugar crystals or perfume the air with cinnamon. They were lumpy, brown, and vaguely threatening if stored too close to the fire. But they got the job done. They filled the stomach, lasted longer than most breads, and could be eaten cold without complaint. Soldiers tucked them into their packs. Farmers chewed them in the fields. Philosophers nibbled them between bitter arguments about virtue and tax law. And while the rich dressed theirs up with sesame seeds, spices, and smugness, the humble versions remained beloved across all strata. You'd find them at festivals, handed out like rustic granola bars. You'd see children gnawing them into submission in the forum. They became offerings to household gods, symbols of prosperity made from leftovers. Their texture, chewy. Their taste depended heavily on the sun that day and the ambition of the cook. Sometimes they were wrapped in leaves, more to keep your hands clean than for any aesthetic value. And they didn't melt, splatter, or explode. They sat quietly in your pouch or hand until you were ready, and then they delivered, sweetness with a hint of mystery and a touch of tang that made you wonder if the fig had turned or just evolved. But perhaps the best thing about fig cakes wasn't their flavor. It was their honesty. No pretense, no ceremony. Just a sticky, dense, functional lump that reminded you life didn't always need to be extravagant to be good. In a city obsessed with spectacle and status, the fig cake was something rare, a modest, dependable companion that didn't care who you were or how many coins clinked in your purse. It simply was. And sometimes that was exactly what Rome needed. Now your senses, already dulled by salt, grease, and Roman bravado, begin to crave something simpler, something dry, perhaps, or comforting. Maybe just familiar, but it's Rome, and nothing is ever that straightforward. So instead, your breakfast arrives in the form of yesterday's bread drowned in last week's wine. Sopion vinum, the Romans called it. Bread in wine. The meal of the rushed, the poor, the hungover, and occasionally the nostalgic elite pretending to slum it. It begins with a hunk of old bread, tough enough to double as a weapon. Fresh bread was rare and expensive. If you had any, it was probably stolen, hoarded, or eaten the moment it came out of the oven. So what remained were the leftovers, dry, rigid, and one argument away from becoming brick. But Rome had wine, always wine. Not the kind that's sipped and swirled and spoken about. No, this was table wine. Common, sour, watered down to varying degrees of tragedy. The solution was to tear the bread into chunks, drop it into a bowl or cup, and let it soak until the mixture turned into a slurry of softened crumbs and fermented melancholy. Sometimes people added herbs, even honey, if they were feeling whimsical or had someone to impress. But mostly it was about making the bread chewable and the wine tolerable. Red or white didn't matter. What mattered was that it went down. This dish wasn't reserved for mornings. It showed up in forums, in workshops, in back rooms behind temples. Philosophers took spoonfuls between long lectures. Laborers shoveled it in before heading off to haul stones in the sun. Soldiers spooned it into their mouths before a march. It was sustenance, fast and forgettable. The ancient Roman version of instant noodles, if your noodles were made of despair and soaked in expired Cabernet. Still, there was something oddly democratic about it. Even the wealthy would dabble. They'd prepare versions with spiced wine, soft spelt loaves, and smug satisfaction. They claimed to be honoring the rustic roots of Rome, though they did it from reclining couches with servants standing by. Meanwhile, for everyone else, it was just breakfast. Not joyous, not memorable, but good enough. And for a culture where the day ahead could include riots, invasions, awkward family politics, or an unfortunate run-in with a senator's ego, starting the morning with wine-soaked bread had its advantages. It didn't inspire. It didn't disappoint. It merely existed, a functional meal in a dysfunctional city. And sometimes that was all you needed to survive. In Rome, nothing went to waste. Not ambition, not bathwater, and certainly not meat. And when it came to meat, the question was never, what part should we eat? But rather, what part haven't we figured out how to grind, stuff, and salt into a sausage? Enter the Lucanica, Rome's answer to the ancient mystery meat conundrum. A sausage that wasn't just food, but a philosophy. Take everything unidentifiable, season it aggressively, and make it delicious enough that nobody asks follow-up questions. The name came from Lucania, a region in southern Italy, but by the time it reached the capital, no one cared where it was from. What mattered was how it smelled. Spicy, smoky, and brashly untrustworthy. The typical ingredients included pork, sure, but also liver, lung, heart, fat, maybe a toe or two if the butcher wasn't paying attention. Seasonings were plentiful: pepper, cumin, fennel seed, garlic, all bold enough to shout over the taste of whatever unfortunate organ had found its way inside. The casing, intestine naturally, slippery, translucent, and elastic enough to hold both meat and Roman expectations. Once stuffed, the sausages were grilled, smoked, fried, or left to hang until they reached that perfect stage between cured and potentially cursed. Street vendors would set up makeshift braziers, their fires flickering beside mosaicked walkways, sending up clouds of greasy perfume that could lure in philosophers and pickpockets alike. And people lined up, always. Wrapped in cloaks, tunics twisted from the day's wear, they stood shoulder to shoulder, clinking coins, willing to gamble on the contents of the sausage in exchange for a bite of warmth and salt. Children tugged at their parents' hems, pointing eagerly. Soldiers craved the calorie-dense hit before a march. Even senators, in moments of anonymity, ducked into alleys for a mouthful of forbidden grease. But the quality, that was a dice roll. If you were lucky, it was rich and savory, laced with fat and spice. If not, you got the chewy horror of something that once pulsed. There were stories. Always stories of donkey bits, dog parts, or meats of indeterminate origin slipping in when supplies ran thin. And with no refrigeration, time became an ingredient. Some sausages aged gracefully. Others began plotting rebellion. Still, Lucanica persisted. It wasn't just sold in markets, it went to war. Soldiers carried dried sausages in their kits, compact, hearty, and able to withstand heat, rain, or awkward silences around the campfire. They became fuel for empire, edible relics of Rome's practicality and disregard for squeamishness. It was more than a snack. It was a survival strategy, a culinary loophole. A way of saying, we may not know what's in this, but it tastes like we're winning. And in Rome, that was all that mattered. You've survived Rome's more ambitious food experiments, mice, cheese lava, fig bricks, and now your tongue yearns for something humble, something flat, something you can eat without preparation or existential dread. And so, you find yourself staring at a humble alia, what we might generously call a pancake. Though in Rome, pancakes weren't fluffy clouds of syrup-drenched joy. They were more like edible parchments, thin, tough, and bearing the hopeful name, another sweet, even when sweetness was merely aspirational. Made from spelt flour, eggs, and milk. Sometimes with honey if fortune smiled. Alia was the Roman attempt at making flour exciting. You mixed the batter and poured it into a pan that may or may not have been cleaned since the last Saturnalia. If the fire cooperated, the edges crisped. If not, you got a limp beige disc with the texture of damp scrolls. Still, these pancakes did the job. They were versatile. Eaten hot, cold, stale, or over a conversation you were trying to escape. They weren't designed for delight. They were designed for survival. Occasionally, someone would try to dress them up. A sprinkle of poppy seeds here, a streak of honey there. But even those additions couldn't mask the reality. This was food for the in-between moments, the space between meals, the time between hope and disappointment. Romans didn't sit around craving alia. They just accepted it the way one accepts rain or senators. Yet, in their own way, these pancakes had charm. They didn't fight back. They didn't burn your fingers or demand a prayer before ingestion. They filled your stomach and left your soul relatively untroubled. And sometimes, just sometimes, if the batter was thin enough, the oil hot enough, and the honey generously applied, you'd take a bite and think, this isn't terrible. That rare moment of mediocrity masquerading as pleasure was, for the average Roman, a quiet triumph. Because in a city where dinner could involve vinegar-soaked onions or animal parts disguised as cuisine, the humble alia stood as a culinary shrug, a reminder that not every dish needed to be a performance. Some just needed to be edible. And in Rome, that was a victory. If Roman cuisine had a motto, it might have been, if it swims and fits in a pan, it's dinner. Nowhere was this ethos more obvious than in the fried fish stalls along the bustling docks of Ostia or the winding alleys of the Subura district. The scent hit you before you saw the source, an oily perfume of sea and sizzle, impossible to ignore, difficult to resist. You followed your nose to the tray of small, crispy creatures, fish heads, tails, fins, entire bodies, all battered in something that may have been flour and tossed into bubbling oil with reckless confidence. There were no distinctions made. Anchovies, sardines, the occasional nameless sea thing. If it was small and dead, it went in the fryer. The cooking process was straightforward. Heat oil until dangerously enthusiastic, toss in fish, salt like you're trying to preserve it for the apocalypse, and serve. Vinegar was an optional luxury, squirted on with a flourish if the vendor had a few coins to spare or a sense of showmanship to maintain. You didn't ask what part of the fish you were eating. You didn't want to know. That was the beauty of it. If it was fried hard enough, identity became irrelevant. What mattered was the crunch, the salt, and the brief moment of fullness that followed. The fish snacks were served in fig leaves or, more often, directly into your open palm, a transfer of heat, flavor, and nutritional ambiguity. And yes, they were nutritious, in a Roman way. You got protein, omega-3s, calcium if you crunched the bones, which you did, because no one was filling anything here. You got energy, too, and a subtle, persistent scent of sea life that clung to your fingers, clothes, and social standing for days. Children ate them like candy. Adults ate them like coping mechanisms. Even philosophers were seen snacking on them mid-debate because nothing inspired nihilism like fish bones between the molars. And despite the chaos and questionable hygiene, the stalls remained popular. Why? Because they delivered what every Roman meal silently promised: immediate satisfaction at the expense of future discomfort. So you stood there, grease trailing down your chin, a small bone lodged somewhere inconvenient, and you thought, this isn't half bad. And then you burped and remembered the Mediterranean was still with you. After enduring the crunchy austerity of fried fish and the wine-soaked humility of Roman breakfast, you might find yourself longing for a snack with just a whisper of wholesomeness. Something that speaks of fruit and softness, not salt and existential dread. That's when you spot them. Fig cakes again, but this time with flair. Not just mashed lumps of overripe fruit, but reimagined into something almost thoughtful. Shaped, sometimes spiced, occasionally elegant. Rome's version of turning leftovers into legacy. Figs were abundant, too abundant. Ripe for a matter of hours, they were practically born fermenting. So instead of wasting them, Romans mashed them into thick, sticky paste, added flour or nuts if they had any, and formed them into portable discs. Sometimes they were flattened, sometimes rolled, occasionally wrapped in leaves. They were utilitarian in design and suspicious in texture. Chewy, dense, and always on the edge of going bad. A snack balanced between nutrition and accident. But they were everywhere. Not because they were glamorous, but because they worked. They were filling. They didn't spoil easily, unless they did. They required no preparation, just teeth and acceptance. Farmers packed them for the fields. Philosophers kept them nearby during long days of thinking dangerously. Even the wealthy, ever concerned with appearances, would serve them during festivals, though their version might include sesame seeds or an unnecessary sprinkle of ground dates imported from somewhere unreasonably far away. These cakes weren't desserts. They were sustenance with ambition, and they stuck with you, literally. They clung to your fingers, your pouch, your dignity. Children gnawed on them like teething rings. Adults offered them as peace tokens or quiet insults, depending on how overripe they'd become. But despite their unassuming shape and murky sweetness, they endured. They were Roman through and through. Not beautiful, not delicate, but reliable. They didn't crumble. They didn't melt. They didn't care who you were. You could be a senator or a slave, a soldier or a poet, and the fig cake would greet you the same way, with indifference and a quiet, sugary resilience. And maybe that's why people loved them. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they didn't pretend to be. In a world full of spectacle and performance, fig cakes were just fig cakes. Modest, sticky, satisfying. And sometimes, in a city obsessed with appearances, that was the most honest thing you could eat. By now, your journey through Rome's edible underworld has taken you from greasy stalls to honey-drenched chaos, but there's still one craving lingering in the background. Comfort. Not emotional comfort, mind you. That was rare in Rome, but edible comfort, the kind you could grasp between meals, carry in your pouch, and chew slowly while pretending you weren't making terrible life choices. Enter cheese snacks, Rome's unlikely champions of convenience and chaos. To the Romans, cheese wasn't a food, it was a lifestyle. They made it in endless varieties, soft, hard, aged, fresh, salted until it hissed at sunlight. Cheese was rural and urban, poor and aristocratic. It appeared at banquets and barracks, and most importantly, it was portable, which meant it was destined to become a snack. Take, for example, the fried cheese patty. Made by mixing soft, curd-like cheese, probably something resembling ricotta, with flour or semolina, shaped into small rounds and fried in oil until golden. Sounds delicious. And it was, for approximately 5 minutes. Because once cooled, these things hardened like sandals left too long in the sun. Bite into a cold one, and you are rewarded with the texture of regret and the flavor of dairy betrayal. There were sweet versions, glazed in honey and served to dinner guests who were already too polite or too drunk to protest. There were savory versions, packed with herbs, salt, and occasionally surprise ingredients like crushed nuts or dried fruit. Sometimes these additions worked. Sometimes they made you feel like someone had lost a bet in the kitchen. And then there was the aged cheese. Not the elegant, soft-spoken variety we associate with wine tastings. This was cheese that had survived a campaign, insulted a senator, and possibly fought off wild dogs. Hard, pungent, and frequently stored in baskets or hung in kitchens until it no longer recognized its origins. It didn't spoil exactly. It matured into something sharper than most Roman wit and potent enough to earn a wide berth at festivals. But cheese was loved, fiercely and unapologetically. It was gifted during Saturnalia. It was eaten by soldiers and philosophers alike. It could be sliced, crumbled, fried, baked, melted, or weaponized, depending on your needs. And best of all, it didn't demand ceremony. You could nibble it on the street or serve it on a silver tray, and it still made sense. Cheese, in Rome, was dependable. It didn't explode like globuli. It didn't stare back like dormice. It didn't crunch like regret. It simply filled you, satisfied you, and occasionally cleared the area around you with its scent. And sometimes, that was the most generous thing a snack could offer. You've had the flat cakes and the fried fish, the sweets that stuck to your teeth and the meats that haunted your conscience. But now your senses long for something bold, something ancient, something that roared with flavor. Enter garum, the fermented fish sauce that was less a condiment and more an identity. To the Romans, it was culinary alchemy. To modern sensibilities, it might be chemical warfare, but in Rome, it was everywhere. Garum began life as a nightmare. Fish guts layered with salt, sealed in clay jars, and left under the sun until they stopped struggling and started fermenting. The result was a pungent, oily, brown liquid. Intensely salty, faintly fishy, and utterly addictive. It clung to food and memory alike. It went on meats, vegetables, grains, even sweets. If you could pour it, someone had already tried it on something they shouldn't have. Vendors sold different grades. The cheapest was sludge, scraped from the bottom of fermentation vats and handed off to the desperate or the indifferent. The elite paid dearly for the top-shelf varieties, liquids so carefully aged and strained they practically glowed with social prestige. Bottles bore inscriptions claiming origin, purity, and dubious health benefits. This wasn't just fish juice. This was a statement. But garum wasn't just about flavor. It was about transformation. A bland grain dish became edible. A boiled vegetable became desirable. A sausage of mysterious contents became something close to transcendent. Drenching food in garum was an act of defiance against blandness, against decay, against a world that otherwise offered little mercy. And yet the production of it was so foul, so overwhelming, that the law literally exiled its manufacture outside city walls. Not even Rome, a city tolerant of sewage rivers and street-side eels, could abide the scent of garum in progress. But once sealed, once bottled, it became indispensable. It moved through markets like liquid gold. Emperors hoarded it. Cooks lived by it. Poets even mentioned it in verses, elevating fermented fish into something poetic. Did people actually like it? Apparently. There were recipes that began with, "First, pour on the garum," as if there was no world in which it wouldn't be the foundation of flavor. Was it healthy? Maybe. Was it overwhelming? Always. But it lingered, in breath, in clothing, in memory. And it represented something only Rome could truly love, a flavor born of death and decay that somehow gave food new life. So if you're imagining Roman snacks, cheese balls, fig cakes, roasted nuts, don't forget the finishing touch, a splash of garum to bind them all together, because in Rome, victory didn't always taste sweet. Sometimes it tasted fermented, and the people loved it anyway. After all the decadence, danger, and digestive risks, sometimes a Roman just wanted something they could hold in one hand and forget in the other. No sauces, no stuffing, no philosophical metaphors, just crunch. That's where roasted street nuts came in, the unsung heroes of Roman snacking. Simple, reliable, and surprisingly chaotic. You'd hear them before you saw them, crackling over open coals, popping in iron pans. Their aroma cutting through the sea of vinegar and garum like a promise of uncomplicated pleasure. Vendors shouted over each other in the busy alleys of Subura, in the port of Ostia, or near the steps of the Senate, offering warm cones of almonds, hazelnuts, walnuts, and the occasional pine nut, if you were wealthy or lucky or both. Some were salted, some glazed in honey, some just roasted plain, because simplicity, when done right, could be its own kind of luxury. Presentation wasn't fancy. You'd get a handful tucked into a scrap of reused parchment or waxed papyrus, maybe with a faded grocery list still scribbled faintly on the side. Olives, lamp oil. Lentils. Now it carried almonds instead. An edible fortune or a fire hazard, depending on how fresh the ink was. Everyone ate them. Gladiators munched them before matches. Philosophers popped them into their mouths while debating the nature of justice. Drunken revelers at Saturnalia tossed them at each other, sometimes aiming for mouths, sometimes for open wine cups, usually missing both. Even emperors indulged, though theirs came peeled, gold-dusted, and likely hand-fed by someone hoping for a promotion. Some nuts were candied, coated in thick amber shells of honey, until they shattered like ancient toffee in your mouth. These were the Roman answer to sweets you could chew and regret later, because while they were delicious, they could also crack a tooth if the roasting was too enthusiastic or the nut too old. There were, of course, risks. Overeating, especially garum-dusted nuts, might lead to indigestion, bloating, or unwanted philosophical introspection. But that rarely stopped anyone. Because nuts were fast, they were portable. And in a world where meals could involve boiled onions, mouse-stuffed rodents, or goat-lung sausages, a warm handful of salted almonds was pure, uncomplicated joy. They were, in many ways, the Roman vending machine. Drop a coin, get a crunch. No drama, no surprises. Just something warm in your palm and salt on your tongue. And for a city that ran on ambition and wine fumes, that was more than enough. After a night of indulgence, and in Rome, indulgence could mean anything from singing at a festival to accidentally making out with your cousin's slave, morning came hard and unforgiving. Your toga is on sideways. Your mouth tastes like someone bottled a regret and poured it over a salted fish. You're not sure whose house you're in, but you're definitely in need of salvation. In modern times, this is where you might reach for black coffee or aspirin. But ancient Rome had its own strange arsenal of recovery food, and subtlety was never on the menu. First, there was the fallback of all fallbacks. Stale bread soaked in wine. Again. Because apparently, if wine broke you, more wine would fix you, as long as it came delivered via the same loaf that nearly cracked your tooth yesterday. The logic wasn't exactly medical, but it was consistent. Bread softened in sour wine, eaten slowly, was believed to bring balance back to the body, or at least prevent it from violently rebelling. For those who needed a bit more theatrical flair with their cure, there was puska o vata, a raw egg whisked directly into spiced wine. Think of it as Rome's version of a protein shake, but without refrigeration, flavor, or dignity. Downing it required courage and a strong will not to immediately offer it back to the gods. Yet older Romans swore by it. They said it restored humors, stabilized the spirit, and maybe even reminded you that you were alive, whether you liked it or not. Still woozy, the Romans turned to the sacred trifecta of sour, greasy, and pungent. A plate might be set before you, piled with olives, garlic, and vinegar-soaked onions. Foods that didn't so much heal as shock. One bite, and your sinuses cleared, your regrets resurfaced, and your hangover suddenly felt less important than surviving the next mouthful. Pickled fish could make an appearance too, just in case you needed your stomach tested by salt and brine. Then there was fried cabbage. Yes, fried cabbage with cumin and oil. Allegedly a miracle. Realistically, a punishment. Roman physicians claimed it could absorb toxins and cool the belly. Diners claimed it started arguments. Either way, it was popular, especially among those who believed pain was a sign of progress. But Rome wasn't without sweetness. For the tender-hearted, or those who physically couldn't stomach cabbage, there were figs soaked in honey and vinegar, or dates marinated in wine and dusted with pepper. These had the double benefit of rehydrating your soul and distracting you from your headache. They were chewy, sweet, and strange enough to convince your body that something good might still happen today. And when all else failed, go full gladiator. Raw onion, handful of barley, and maybe a slap on the chest from a friend who thought encouragement was a full-contact sport. There were no guarantees, only traditions. Romans didn't call it a hangover. They said the mind was troubled. And with food like this, maybe that was the best diagnosis. So you sat hunched at the thermopolium counter, sipping sour wine with a spoon, chewing something that may or may not be cabbage, and whispering prayers to Bacchus for mercy. This was not recovery. This was survival, Roman style. After tasting your way through garum-drenched morsels and honey-soaked indulgences, there comes a moment in Rome when all you want is to disappear into the crowd, hold something familiar in one hand, and forget your troubles in the repetitive joy of chewing. That's when the nuts return. Not the ones you cracked in the forum last week, but a fresh batch, warm, fragrant, and waiting. Roman street nuts were the backbone of the casual snack economy. You didn't need a seat, a plate, or an occasion. Just a coin and a hand. Vendors roamed the city or set up on busy corners, tending fires and rotating pans filled with almonds, hazelnuts, pine nuts, and walnuts. The smell was irresistible, a mixture of smoke, salt, and roasted fat. Not the cozy, cinnamon-spiced aroma we now associate with roasted nuts, but something more primal, something that smelled like hunger remembered. Presentation was secondary. The nuts were scooped into makeshift cones, twisted from scraps of old papyrus, broken wax tablets, or anything vaguely rigid. Sometimes these impromptu wrappers still had scribbled notes on them. Lists of market goods, love letters, crude jokes. Your snack might come with bonus reading material if you were lucky, or confused. And Rome adored them. Philosophers snacked while crafting rhetorical traps. Poets munched while composing insults. Slaves stole them. Emperors hoarded them. Even gladiators crunched them between rounds of blood sport, because nothing pairs with mortal combat like a handful of toasted walnuts. They were a shared language, a classless delight, though, of course, the pine nuts were another story. Those were for the rich. Pricey, delicate, and likely delivered on polished platters by trembling hands. Some versions were sweet, honey-coated, crisp, and addictive. Others were dusted with herbs or garum, offering that salty punch Rome couldn't seem to resist. But whatever the flavor, The nuts provided something no other Roman food could: freedom. They weren't messy. They didn't stain your toga. You didn't need to sit down or prepare your stomach for battle. You could walk, argue, scheme, and snack all at once. Of course, overindulgence came at a cost. Too many honeyed almonds and your stomach staged a quiet revolt. Too many garum-glazed hazelnuts and your evening became a public performance of gastrointestinal regret. But no one cared. Because roasted nuts were cheap, satisfying, and joyfully undemanding. A snack that never judged. A moment of salty clarity in a city always on the verge of collapsing into itself. In the end, they were everything Rome rarely was. Simple, portable, and kind. Eventually, after the festivals, the feasts, the greasy indulgences and questionable meats, Rome always offered a reckoning, and that reckoning usually arrived the next morning. You wake with your face pressed to a marble step, a laurel crown askew on your head, your mouth dry and tasting faintly of fermented fish sauce and regret. Your toga is inside out. Someone may have drawn a phallus on your forehead with charcoal. You need help. Not a prayer, not a bath. A cure, Roman style. The first line of defense was often the same as the last one: wine-soaked bread. Again. Because if there was one universal Roman belief, it was that wine could solve anything, including the mess it made the night before. This time, the bread is staler, the wine sharper. It's less breakfast, more punishment, but you chew, because this is Rome, and dignity was never part of the recipe. Next comes the dreaded pulse ovata, a raw egg swirled into spiced wine. It slides down thick, viscous, with a texture that suggests the gods have abandoned you. Aged relatives and suspicious healers insist this concoction restores your internal balance, that it aligns the humors, that it brings warmth to the blood. What it really brings is the urge to immediately sit down and question your life. Still dizzy, you're handed a plate of food selected by someone who either wants to save your life or see what your limits truly are. Vinegar-drenched onions, salty olives, crushed garlic, maybe even a bite of pickled fish, because nothing clears the sinuses like brine and shame. A mouthful of this and your soul briefly leaves your body before deciding to return out of concern. And then, when all hope seems lost, comes cabbage. Fried in oil, spiced with cumin, and served with the confidence of a dish that's been falsely praised for centuries. Roman doctors swore by it, said it restored clarity, soaked up poison, brought moisture to the bones, or something equally vague. It was hot, greasy, and strangely bitter. You hated it. You ate all of it. But if you were lucky, or merely desperate, there was a sweeter path. Figs soaked in honey and vinegar, or wine-drenched dates dusted with black pepper. These were soft, sweet, and oddly soothing. They didn't fix anything, but they distracted you from the wreckage. And sometimes that was all a cure needed to do. There were more brutal remedies too, gladiator-style cures. A handful of raw barley, an onion bitten into like an apple, a slap across the chest to wake up the lungs. No science, just confidence, stubbornness, and perhaps the secret Roman ingredient: shared suffering. The Romans didn't call this state a hangover. They said you were troubled in the head, and their food, as always, was ready to meet you in that troubled place, not with mercy, but with tradition. You'd sit hunched at the thermopolium, spooning sour cabbage and sipping vinegar, praying to Bacchus and cursing your choices, and somehow, against all odds, you'd survive. There's a moment in every Roman day when indulgence gives way to silence, when the streets dim just slightly, when the laughter fades from the bathhouses and the bread sellers shout a little less aggressively. And that's when you begin to think not about food that shocks, but food that stays. Something stable, reliable, gentle. For the Romans, that usually meant turning to their most sacred obsession: bread. But even that, in typical Roman fashion, came with a twist. They didn't always have fresh loaves on hand. In fact, freshness was often a luxury, and waste was a sin. So the solution was simple, if slightly depressing. Take yesterday's hardened bread, crack it into bowls or jugs, and drown it in wine. Again, yes, we've returned to the great Roman fallback, wine-soaked bread. Only this time it's not for hangovers, not for breakfast. It's a lifestyle, a background snack, a conversation companion, a pause between the noise. Sometimes the bread was soaked until it became a soft, wine-tinged pudding. Other times it barely softened, and each bite required the effort of a minor duel. Red or white wine didn't matter. What mattered was that it was wet, that it kept the jaw moving and the stomach quiet. Occasionally, a few herbs were thrown in. On rare occasions, a drizzle of honey. But even when naked and bitter, this strange cereal endured. There was an honesty to it, a kind of culinary minimalism that stood in defiance of the empire's theatrical palate. Here was food that didn't perform, didn't beg for praise. It simply did its job, chewable, portable, forgettable. You could dip bread during speeches, during bathhouse chats, while eavesdropping on neighbors or waiting for your lover to return from the forum. It became habit more than hunger, a Roman version of absent-minded snacking, dipping, chewing, swallowing, moving on. And of course, even this modest practice was shaped by class. The elite mocked it publicly while indulging privately. Their versions involved aged loaves, vintage wines, delicate infusions, and the smug detachment of people who've never really had to eat for survival. But for everyone else, it was routine. A snack that didn't judge. A ritual without a god. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly good. But in a world spinning with politics, gods, war, and sausage speculation, this one constant remained: stale bread, soaked in wine, chewed with indifference and swallowed with a sigh. Sometimes that was enough. In Rome, it had to be.